There's a song you haven't heard in years, maybe a decade, maybe more. And then one day it comes on, in a grocery store, in someone else's car, or playing from a speaker 3 tables away at a restaurant. And something happens that has no real name. It's not just a memory, it's not just emotion, it's more physical than that. Your chest does a thing, time does a thing. For about 4 seconds, you are somewhere else entirely, someone else entirely. And then it passes, and you're standing in a cereal aisle again, slightly undone, holding a box of Cheerios. Most people chalk this up to nostalgia. Oh, that song brings back memories. As if it's a filing cabinet. As if your brain just pulled out a folder labeled Summer 2009 and showed you a slideshow. But that's not what's happening. Not even close. What's actually happening is closer to resurrection, a temporary one, and understanding the mechanism, the exact neuroscience of why this occurs, completely changes how you see yourself. Especially if you're someone who's been told you feel things too deeply. Because it turns out you don't have a sensitivity problem. You have a more complete archive. I've spent a lot of time at the intersection of behavioral neuroscience and emotional experience, and what I'm about to show you isn't just interesting, it's reorienting. We're going to cover what music actually does in the brain, which is not what you were taught. Why familiar songs don't trigger memories so much as temporarily make you become someone you used to be. Why do sensitive people experience this at a fundamentally different intensity? And why you can't explain in words what a song makes you feel, and what that inability actually reveals about the depth of the experience. Let's start with the neuroscience, because it's weirder than you think. Here's how memory normally works. Something happens. Your brain encodes it through the hippocampus. That's your brain's filing clerk. It packages the experience as a declarative memory, a fact, an event. I was at a concert in June. It was hot. I was with Maya. That memory lives in language, in narrative, in sequence. You can pull it out, inspect it, and question whether it's accurate. It's retrievable, it's rational, it's stored the same way you'd store a note on your phone. Music doesn't go anywhere near that system. Musical memory is encoded in the amygdala, your brain's emotional core, and in the cerebellum, which handles rhythm, movement, and body patterns. These two structures are ancient. They predate language. They predate logic. They're the parts of the brain that keep running when everything else has gone dark. Here's the proof that should stop you cold. People in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease, people who no longer recognize their own children's faces, who can't tell you what year it is, who've lost access to nearly every explicit memory they've ever formed, can still sing along to songs from their teenage years. Word for word. The hippocampus has been devastated. The narrator is gone, but the music is still there, because music was never in the narrator. It was always somewhere deeper. That's already surprising, but that's just the storage mechanism. What that mechanism actually does to you when a song plays, that's where this gets genuinely strange. You're not remembering, you're briefly becoming. When a familiar song plays, your brain doesn't retrieve a file, it reruns a state. Think about who you were the first time that song really meant something to you. You weren't just in a physical location, you were in an emotional architecture, a specific version of yourself, with specific fears, specific longings, specific ways of interpreting the world. The music didn't just exist alongside that version of you, it was encoded with it. They were stored together, as a package. So when the song plays again, the brain doesn't pull up a memory. It reconstructs the emotional state. The amygdala reactivates the original emotional pattern. The nervous system re-enters the original configuration. For a few seconds, sometimes longer, you don't just remember who you were. You briefly are who you were. That's the uncanny feeling. That's the thing that doesn't have a name. It's not nostalgia, which is comfortable and warm and soft around the edges. It's something sharper. It's the feeling of temporarily inhabiting a self that you've since left behind. Which is also why it so often feels like grief. You're not mourning the past. You're mourning the you that existed inside it. The version of you who hadn't yet made certain decisions, lost certain people, hardened in certain places. That version of you briefly shows up, taps you on the shoulder, and then is gone again when the song ends. That's not nostalgia. That's Resurrection, a 4-minute one. And it explains why this hits so much harder than any other kind of memory. Now, if you've always been told you feel music too intensely, that you get too emotional over songs, what I'm about to say is going to completely reframe that. Why emotionally sensitive people feel this more intensely. Some people hear a song from 10 years ago and feel a mild wave of warmth, a pleasant flutter. Other people hear the same song and have to grip a counter because their legs briefly stop working. Same song, completely different experience. Why? It comes down to encoding depth. When you're a high-sensitivity person, and this isn't a diagnosis, it's a documented neurological trait affecting about 15 to 20% of people, your amygdala processes emotional information more thoroughly, more completely, more textured. You're not being dramatic when you say a piece of music feels like a physical event. The neural encoding is actually richer, more dimensional, more complete. So when the song plays, the resurrection is more complete. You don't just get a flavor of who you were, you get the full reactivation, the longing, the specific quality of light you remember, the exact shape of whatever you were afraid of back then. You've been told your whole life that you care too much, that you're too sensitive, you need to dial it back. But what's actually true is that your archive is more detailed, your encoding is more thorough, the library of who you've been is more complete, and when music opens that library, it opens it fully. That's not a flaw. It's a more complete version of what it means to be a person. Here's where this gets even more interesting, because there's a reason you've never been able to explain this feeling to anyone, and it's not because the feeling isn't real, it's because of where it lives. Why can't you explain it in words? Someone asks you, why does that song make you sad? And you start to explain. And what comes out is vague, approximate. You say something like, it just reminds me of a time, or, it's hard to explain, or, it just makes me feel a certain way. And you feel a little embarrassed, like you're failing to articulate something obvious. You're not failing. You're attempting something structurally impossible. Language is processed in Broca's and Wernicke's areas, frontal lobe, cortical, relatively recent in evolutionary terms. The emotional memory is stored in your amygdala, pre-linguistic, pre-verbal. It was encoded before language was involved, stored in bodily sensation and emotional pattern, and it has no natural translation into words. It's like trying to describe a color in a language that has no color words. The experience is real. The limitation is the medium. This is why great music criticism is so hard to write, and why most of it fails. You can describe the technical elements. You cannot describe the experience, because the experience happens in a part of the brain that predates the ability to describe things. When you can't explain why a song undoes you, that's not a sign that the feeling is irrational. It's a sign that the feeling is genuinely deep, too deep for the tools available to you. And so, knowing all of this, what do you actually do with it? Because this isn't just interesting science. It changes how you can use music deliberately. What you actually do with this, here's what changes when you understand the resurrection mechanism. First, you stop being embarrassed by it. When a song briefly undoes you in a grocery store, you're not being irrational or overdramatic. You're having a genuine neurological event. Your brain is briefly rebuilding a previous version of your own nervous system. That's not a weakness. That's depth. Second, you can use it intentionally. Most people use music passively. It happens to them. But if you know that specific songs are essentially emotional state anchors, that they can reactivate specific versions of you, you can start to map that. Which songs put you in a state of focused ambition? Which ones reconnect you to a version of yourself that felt capable? Which ones help you process grief by giving you access to the emotional architecture, where that grief was originally formed? This is what therapists and music psychologists call music-evoked autobiographical memories, and it's one of the most powerful and underused tools for emotional processing available to any person. If this is something you want to go deeper on, understanding your own emotional patterns, and why you experience the world at the intensity you do, I put together a short guide on exactly this. It's linked below. Not a course, not a program, just a clear, evidence-based breakdown of what emotional sensitivity actually is, what causes it neurologically, and how to work with it instead of against it. It's for people who've always felt like they exist at a slightly higher resolution than everyone else, and never quite had the language for it. So, here's what we covered today. Music doesn't go near your normal memory system. It encodes in the ancient, emotional, pre-verbal structures of your brain, the ones that still run when everything else has gone quiet. When a familiar song plays, you don't retrieve a memory. You briefly re-inhabit the emotional state of a version of yourself who no longer exists. That's not nostalgia. That's resurrection. If you feel this more intensely than others, if music has always hit you harder, if you've always been told you're too sensitive, it's because your encoding is deeper, your archive is richer. You're not broken. You're just running at a higher resolution. And the reason you can never quite explain it is that it wasn't stored in language. It was stored in the body, in the parts of you that predate words. Which means every time a song brings you back, really brings you back, you're not just remembering who you were. You're briefly meeting them again. And that's not something to be embarrassed about. That's something to understand.